Hello everybody and welcome back to Rev Left Radio. On today's episode I have back on the show my friend and comrade Tai Lee to talk about basically the psychological, sexual, and gendered politics of fascism. And I think this is an incredibly important and timely episode for a multitude of reasons. We see the rise of the Manosphere online. We see the overturning of Roe with the Dobbs decision. We see this relentless new resurging attack on the LGBTQ community broadly, and even the declarations on the right about rolling back even things that we took for granted like contraception, same-sex marriage, or mixed race marriage is even seemingly on the table now. So to help make sense of this, backward reactionary wave that we're all experiencing and the connections between misogynistic, anti-feminist movements on the far right and anti-LGBTQ movements on the far right. I think it's really important to understand these connections and what's happening, and this is precisely the conversation that tries as best as we can to deal with some of the underlying forces promoting these sorts of formations and ideological approaches at this time. And few guests are as insightful when it comes to this stuff as Tai, and so I'm very excited to share this with you. And as always, if you like what we do here at Rev Left Radio, if you find it valuable, you can share the episode with friends or families, or you can go above and beyond and support us on Patreon. And you can either support us just because you believe in the project, or you can support us because you want to get access to our entire back catalog of exclusive Patreon episodes, as well as bonus monthly episodes, at least one a month, every single month. So we really appreciated it. It's what feeds our families. And, just thank you to anybody who listens, shares, or supports the show in any capacity. But without further ado, here's my conversation with Tai Lee on the psychosexual and gendered politics of fascism.
I'm Tai Lee. I've been on, when was that? I guess a couple of months ago to talk about feminism. And now I'm back with all of these new things that have gone on that are kind of shocking. Things that we didn't think could ever happen kind of all happened in the span of like 2 months. So I think we have a lot of important stuff to talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the changes that have happened just since our last conversation are pretty profound on this front. And so definitely always happy to have you on in general, but definitely happy to have you back on at this time to sort of help me and my audience navigate through these thorny times. And we see, and we'll get into this as well, we see elements of the left being more or less won over to reaction in a way, just in the last few months, really, that I haven't seen in quite a while. So that's not even mentioning the overturning of Roe, and so we have a lot to get through. So let's just go ahead and dive into it. So the first question is, we framed this conversation as sort of, or when you sent it to me, the headline was the sexual politics of fascism, and we want to sort of explore these intersections of fascist ideology and anti-LGBTQ ideology and anti-feminist ideology and how they all sort of bolster each other. So what are the sexual politics of fascism, and what is male supremacy? And how does bringing in a feminist analysis help us to understand fascism more broadly?
So I think that, just to start off, I think that in order to combat fascism, we must be militant feminists. And I think that's something that we take for granted for a lot of different reasons. I think that one of them is, the metaphysics of male dominance are almost perfect. So you can't really necessarily see how subjugated women are as a group. It's so permeates through every aspect of our culture, and it is so just entrenched in every single aspect of our lives that we don't even necessarily clock it or check it, right? And because there's men of all different classes and races who are subjugated on different axes of oppression, sometimes we take for granted that them being men is still something that gives them such a power over women. And fascists correctly understand this and build kind of their whole entire political line off of this subjugation of women. And the thing that fascists are really good at as well is they can make certain promises to women. So the right does a really good job at mobilizing women as women. So what I mean by that is they understand the stakes of what it means to be a woman, and they can offer women what I would consider like protectionism. So they say, look, we understand that this world is very dangerous for women in a lot of certain respects. So we're going to give you the patriarchal nuclear family that's going to give you some amount of stability. Whereas, the women's liberation kind of makes women more independent. And that's actually something that's really scary. And particularly white women are attracted to the right because there's all of these promises of a kind of surer bet, right? And the right really understands this. And you see it in, what's her name? J.K. Rowling. She's a right-wing woman, right? Mm-hmm. And so her whole entire politics of this turf gender criticalism is all centered around this protectionism of women, protecting us. The trans enemy is going to come into the bathroom and, rape you in the bathroom, right? That's kind of, so their entire politics is about, understanding actually genuine fears that women have, right? Women are subject to all of this sexual violence. Women are subject to economic desperation because we're women, and the way that the economy is set up, we are so dependent on men, right? All of these fears are legitimate fears, but the right offers these really reactionary solutions to these problems, and also scapegoats onto marginalized groups. So when we're thinking about trans people within the context of the sexual politics of fascism, they sit at a very dangerous place because a core tenet of fascism is also needing to this kind of fear of difference. And let me pull up this one essay that I wanted to talk about a little bit here.
Sure.
Umberto Eco has a list of what he calls the 14 common features of fascism. And number 5 on that list is the fear of difference. So the first appeal of a fascist movement is an appeal against the intruders, right? So when we're thinking about trans people, and when we're thinking about all of this backlash against trans people are so often in the fascist imaginary painted as these intruders from the outside, this stranger danger coming into the women's restroom to hurt women, coming in to destroy the nuclear family. They're these outsiders that are going to fundamentally destabilize all of these things that are supposed to keep us safe, right? And so in this way, you can think of the anti-trans movement as a kind of racism as well, and this kind of fear of the outsiders. And this is really dangerous because it's literally inciting violence against a very marginalized group. And that's really scary. And it's happening not only from the very obvious, right-wing legislature that is trying to get, trans people, basically trans children, making them targets of the state, but also even in certain strands of feminism, which we talked about on the last time I was on the podcast, the TERFs and the gender critical movement. They're playing a pretty essential role in the rise of fascism. And they reveal, I think they most obviously reveal the kind of ideology of gender within a kind of fascist regime. And they express that really, really obviously in their hatred of trans people. So this idea of fear of difference is essential to that. And you see them also going after gay marriage as well. That's something that's on the table as under threat. I have my criticisms of marriage as an institution in general, but that kind of attack on the acceptance of gay people into what they would consider the heterosexual family they are going to attack that because it's seen as destabilizing. It's the outsider coming in to kind of ruin this sacred vestige of white supremacy, really, too, as well.
Yeah, I just wonder about the destabilization and the fears around it, as there's a broader destabilization in our political, economic, and social arenas. It seems to be timed perfectly with this new wave of reaction, even on issues that we thought were ostensibly settled 10, 15 years ago, like gay marriage. That was pretty much a dead and buried issue. People broadly accepted it. Polls show that across the political spectrum, people were fine with it. And I really thought we're certainly going to have other forms of reaction against the LGBTQ community, but perhaps this one thing is more or less settled and we'll be fighting at different levels. But there seems to now be a reintroducing of even things that we thought were settled as now being a spearhead of this fascist revanchism, if you will.
Yeah, I absolutely. And fascism begins in the home. Fascism begins with these ideas about, what the family has to do. The family has to be heterosexual because the man has to control the woman and the children. And, this is so central to their obsession with tradition. Really, it's a cult of tradition. And so now, when you think of it like that, and you understand this obsession that they have with tradition as something that is fundamental to their entire politics, then basically all of these things that we thought were, more or less done and dusted are back on the table as things that are under threat again. Like the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which, we've known, it was one of those things where it's like, for the past 50 years, we've always known that the most extremist elements of the right was going to attack Roe. We knew that in theory, and we would talk about it. And feminists would say, yeah, they're going to go after Roe. They're going to go after Roe. But it was also kind of a cynical wedge issue that both the Democrats and the Republicans used to try to, galvanize their base. Ever since I was born and since I can remember, I kind of just figured they'll always use it as a wedge issue, and there's a lot of political currency in that, and therefore they'll always use it as like a carrot on the stick to kind of, I never thought that they would actually do it. And they've done it, and the scary shit is they've done it through the Supreme Courts, which is not a democratic body. If you can call any of the political bodies in from the American state democratic, I don't know if you could, but definitely not the Supreme Court. And they basically, in the past, since I guess early May is when when that leak came out. Since then, they've basically, I guess you could call it a judicial coup, in the highest court of the land, basically entrenching a deeply fascist politics, and they've just done one after the other, after the other, after the other. And, overturning Roe was the beginning of that. And it's scary to know that we now live in a, quote, post-Roe world. And that, to me, was always something that was like a boogeyman, but I never thought I'd see the day. The day has come, and it is a really terrifying reality, but it's central to their mission as fascists, because if you want a fascist regime, you cannot give women that level of power over their own body. It's completely and totally antithetical to the position that women need to be in order for fascism to work. And so the first order of business is, abortion ban. It's very alarming. It's super, super, super reactionary. And as we all, we know that, but it's only the idea that that's only the beginning is really fucking terrifying.
It really is. And, there are many different strains of fascism, but this is coming out of a specifically religious, Christian nationalist inflected, authoritarianism, which is theocratic fascism. It is the imposition of reactionary religious ideas imposing that on the, literal bodies of other human beings who do not often even share your religion, but even if they do, might not share your interpretation of that one religious claim. So it is that entails violence, that entails policing, that entails the carceral state, that entails suffering, death, and misery for women and children alike. And so in that sense, it is thoroughly violent, thoroughly fascist, and thoroughly theocratic. But the right wing in this country, whatever slice of that right wing pie you want to point out, knows that their general ideas, insofar as they have any, any solutions to any problems or any vision of a future, are deeply unpopular with the American people, even deeply unpopular with elements of their own base. And so they know if they want to achieve something like this, it's going to have to be through a mechanism that is completely impervious to any form of democratic accountability. And SCOTUS is just that.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. And, you can already see, they knew that they had to do it through SCOTUS, but there's also a lot of ideological work being done there, because now they can actually get people to agree with these more, extremist points. So, and this is maybe a good time to talk about these kind of right deviations that we're seeing on the left. After all of this, after what was essentially a judicial coup, the kind of air we were breathing around us has become so much more reactionary and volatile. And you see just a rapid shift to the right across the spectrum. Everyone is super susceptible to these kind of reactionary ideologies that are now just kind of in common parlance, even more so than they were before. And so, the kind of the turf gender critical stuff is kind of, I think, like a gateway drug to a larger set of deeply white supremacist politics and ultimately a deeply fascist politics. Like, this kind of anti-woke left, right, in scare quotes, has become even more popular in the past 3 months. It was already stupid and it was already present online, but it's only become more popular. And a lot of the people that get into that shit, this anti-woke leftism, which is actually just rightism, right. It has nothing to do with leftism at all.
Social reactionaryism.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of what gets them into that is this kind of gender criticalism. That's like the first step that will take them there. It's through the politics of gender and through enforcing these super, super patriarchal gender norms. And then, they kind of start drinking that Kool-Aid a little bit. And then in the span of, sometimes it happens in like 2 weeks, they're basically now full-blown fascists. Yeah. I've seen it now with like 5 different people. And, Esperanza makes a great point that a lot of these people, the reason that they're so much more susceptible to these, the social reactionary fucking bullshit is because they're also not organized.
100%.
So you have people that are just very alienated, atomized, isolated, who have ostensibly left views that then basically start sipping the Kool-Aid of this anti-trans ideology. They have nothing to ground them. They're online all day, every day, basically getting spoonfuls of propaganda just, shoveled into them. And then, once they start in on the anti-trans shit, it's very hard to get them to see, where they're headed.
Yeah. And well, just one of the benefits of organizing, and I know you know this, and Esperanza has pointed this out as well, is that you're accountable to an organization. You're among everyday working class people and all their varied differences. You're held accountable to certain standards of behavior and obligation to others. When you're just online, filtering your mind through the kaleidoscopic prism of the internet's algorithm, and you're not accountable to anybody. Let's say you even view yourself as a bit of an influencer online. You're just completely untethered from anything that would keep you grounded or keep you connected to real people and their actual struggles. And so you can easily be, floated off into these fever dreams of, trans women are the main enemy and they're coming for all of us, and it's just sad to see, but you can see how it happens.
Yeah. And that's another kind of, red flag of fascism as well is they're conspiratorial. So
yeah, exactly.
They're not thinking through systems and structures and history. They're thinking through conspiracy. And this is another one of the points of the 14 points of fascism in this essay, and I'll send it to you so we can link it. It's number 7, the obsession with a plot. So this kind of international conspiracy against what fascists would call the working class, in scare quotes. It's actually a petty bourgeois white male subject that they calling the working class, right? And so they're obsessed with this international plot that's coming to that's coming after them. And this is something that is so obvious with the anti-trans shit. They literally think that that trans existence is something that is being funded by big pharma and funded by this kind of international Jewish conspiracy.
Stupid.
It's really, really, really anti-Semitic as well.
Yeah.
And it's super nefarious that they do this, because there is criticisms to be made of the beauty industry, right? Mm-hmm. Of course, selling women this idea of like this perfect image of woman, and that should be criticized, but they lump in the existence of trans people with that critique of the beauty industry, and then they turn it into this kind of global conspiracy of big pharma, and big pharma is the beauty industry. It all kind of, it's super irrational. There's not a whole lot of sense to be made of it, but that is certainly a part of this anti-trans movement that in my dealings with it and in my experience with trying to get people to understand where they're going wrong, I've realized that this is a core tenet of this theocratic fascism, is this super anti-trans vitriol. And, they really, really do think that it's like, a global international conspiracy to destroy women, right? But as Marxists, we know that, the main oppressor of women is imperialism. That is women's enemy, is imperialism. And so this international conspiracy serves as a mask to hide who women's real oppressor is, which is, imperialism in the bourgeoisie. So all of this is in service of protecting, the status quo, even though it posits itself as being super critical of and aware of like what's really going on. It's actually smoke and mirrors that ends up serving, imperialist patriarchy, really.
Yes, taking your eyes off of the real people with power and wealth and towards the marginalized and vulnerable is a fascist move. And what many on the so-called left have been doing, or, these are not the left anymore, but these rightists, is doing exactly that by tying the entire LGBTQ movement, really, in some articulations of this, more or less obvious conspiracy theory, tying the entire movement to those forces of capital, as if, the whole LGBTQ acceptance movement is a huge psyop from those in charge, right? Like, it gets very, very crazy, and it is rooted 100% in conspiracy theories. And you could see a lot of people that made this move getting very conspiratorial about COVID, and buying into a lot of like the replacement or even Great Reset theories.
Yeah, and that's super white supremacist. I mean,
100%.
The Great Replacement theory and the Great Reset theory, all of that shit is, again, conspiratorial. It's not historically accurate or any kind of structural Marxist analysis whatsoever. But it's interesting that like something like Great Replacement theory, Great Reset theory, these were things that were super niche, like people were not really talking about them, even though if you are someone who is studying your enemy, which we all should be, I've heard at length of things like Great Replacement theory, but these were like niche things that were not really talked about. But now they're seemingly everywhere. I mean, it has been such a regressive backslide into fascism so quickly that if you don't have a strong ideological base, if you're not organized, you're really susceptible to this shit, and it's scary. And the way that it's all posited as this kind of common sense, you know, how come we didn't see it before? How come we didn't see the great trans conspiracy before? Now it's so obvious. And and literally these people think that in the future, in the next 10 years or whatever, everyone's going to come around to their side and see that we were all just duped into believing that trans people actually exist. And they, now they're being unfairly victimized. These TERFs, these gender criticalists, they really think that they're being unfairly victimized by, the left, and that soon we will all come around and realize that they were right all along. It's a very heroic, they view themselves as these kind of heroes as well, which is another aspect of fascist ideology.
Well, yeah, the reactionary fascist ideology, however you want to put it, even just regular run-of-the-mill conservatives, all of them have this martyr complex, this idea that even though that, they are in the majority of the religious, racial, even sometimes class makeup of a society, that actually they are the ones constantly being attacked, constantly being the victim of some conspiracy or some top-down approach to squish them, even though by all objective measures, they tend to be on the majority side of every identity issue in particular, and often in the petty bourgeois or comfortable middle class section of the class strata itself. And so I think that need to be a victim and to see themselves as under siege is a core tenet of all right-wing politics. And when you see people displaying that on the so-called left, when they are actively dehumanizing and making more vulnerable an already marginalized and vulnerable community, but acting as if they're the ones who are under attack, that is a classic hallmark of reaction.
Yeah, totally.
Well, yeah, let's go ahead and ask this next question here. And I'm actually kind of interested in this because we see this attack on women in the form, most obviously, of the Dobbs decision to dismantle constitutional right to an abortion for women across the country, and then the subsequent onslaughts in specific states, and the national hope that they're going to, win over Congress, the Senate, eventually the presidency, and enact a ban nationwide. That's certainly their goal, as well as, overturning gay marriage. Some people are even talking about contraception and mixed marriages, right? Racially mixed marriages. It's absolutely insane. But this attack is happening at the same time as this new wave of reaction against the LGBTQ community is happening. And so you can see how when the fascist or the reactionaries of any sort are on the march, they're on the march against both at the same time. And what you see some people on the TERF side of things doing is reifying this division. Doubling down on the division between cis and trans women in particular at a time when trans women in particular are under attack, when women are under attack, and they would serve, their own interests to come together and to fight together as human beings for the liberation of and equality of everybody. But these people are driving a wedge between them such that it makes that impossible. Treating this not even really, there's no inherent contradiction between cis women and trans women. Certainly, even if there were one, it's certainly not antagonistic at this time. So people insisting that this is not only a contradiction, but an antagonistic one, are doing this very reactionary thing of dividing, women, but also just dividing the working class, because cis women and trans women, disproportionately make up the working class. Our job as communists and Marxists is to bring the elements of the working class together to become conscious of themselves as a class and come together across differing identities to fight in a common cause. And anybody, stopping that, actively preventing that, regardless of what they think they're doing, are serving reaction. And so I'm just wondering your thoughts on the simultaneity of the attack on women as well as the attack on the LGBTQ community.
Right. So, yeah, these things go together. I want to talk about how they go together, but also I think that there's an important distinction to be made as well, because I think that particularly the attacks on trans people also have a distinct character in and of themselves. But so, I think that the reason that they're doing these things together, right, is attacking both women and the LGBTQ community at the same time, is because they understand the necessity of, heterosexuality has to be the norm, because you have to have women basically being reproductive slaves within the patriarchal nuclear family. So, you know, they understand that both women and gender minorities, people of oppressed genders, people of marginalized genders, and people of oppressed sexualities, you know, you need to impose this violent heterosexuality onto all of us. So the idea that there are people breaking with that is incredibly destabilizing to the fundamental unit in which fascism operates, which is the patriarchal nuclear family. And so that's one aspect of it, right? And also, as well, I think that we have to understand the specific oppression as trans people as something that has a character that is distinct, in that now with the situation of trans people, you have this stranger danger argument. They are the threat from the outside, which I was talking about quite a bit earlier, and scapegoating them. It's fascist scapegoating, saying, you know, all of this violence that is being done to women is being done to them by trans women specifically. The attack on trans women specifically. Now, this is ridiculous on its face, because as we know, as feminists, we know that the most dangerous place for the woman is the patriarchal nuclear family. It is the home. And the person that is most likely to murder you or rape you is not some random trans woman in a bathroom, but it's your husband. and so you have this whole, you know, so they understand. So there's two things happening. They know that they need to entrench the nuclear family. They know that they need to further entrench heterosexuality and make it literally illegal to be anything but a heterosexual. And then they also know that they need to create an enemy that is going to take away, or that is going to create a false consciousness about who is really going to be attacking women the most, which is men, because of the structure of the nuclear family. So these things are working together, interconnected, of course, but also the position that trans women are used in this ideology is a super nefarious one, because it serves to kind of mask the reality of violence against women as well. And, you know, this is a crazy thing that I've realized in these gender critical discourses, is you'll see men, cis men, usually white cis men, as these gender critical feminists, right? And in my mind, I'm like, any dude who is out here preaching any kind of feminism in that way, I'm a little skeptical of. Yep. Because, you know, we should be listening to women in feminism. So any dude that's taking this mantle of being any kind of hardcore feminist, I'm a little like, interesting.
As a side note, don't forget what you're going to say next. I'm sorry, but another version of that is when like I have you on or Esperanza on to, you know, present criticisms of the sex industry completely in line with all of our left-wing communist Marxist values and forms of analysis. The sort of person who responds most vociferously to that, you know, that when these cis men in particular, straight men, are the ones that are most likely to start launching death threats and get super worked up about it, you have to wonder where they're coming from. It is not just, I am just so on the side of sex workers, I can't stand any criticism of the sex trade. No, people like you and Esperanza are actually on the side of sex workers, actually, in Esperanza's case, has lived experience within that industry, is coming out saying legitimate, fair critiques and you know, reflecting on her own experience. And then some like white cis male gets super angry, starts making death threats against a trans woman. I mean, yeah. It's like that. All your alarm bells should be going off, and you should create as much distance between you and that freak as possible.
Exactly correct, and exactly right. That's a great connection to make, because it's the same shit with these gender critical feminist men. You know, they start sounding the alarm. You know, we need to protect women in the bathrooms. The bathroom is such a fucking thing. You know, yeah. The public restroom for these people is like a massive thing, and so, you know, they'll come out and call it feminism, but what they're doing is basically saying that them as men need to take on the role of a patriarchal protector, like a father figure of all of these women who, are so dumb that they can't see that, trans women are such a big threat to them, right? And so then, the big cis man needs to come in and throw down the gauntlet and protect all of these women. It's protectionism, and it's so fucking reactionary. And these reactionary men correctly clock that, this movement is like a honeypot for them, because they can basically further entrench these patriarchal norms in the name of feminism. And they utilize that and they take advantage of this shit but really what they're doing is they're saying, we need to police these strict gender norms, and these reactionary men benefit from policing these strict norms. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's so fundamental to what needs to happen to further entrench their power. And so to see women getting so, standing behind them, I don't think that these women are getting duped. I don't think these women are dumb. I think that they understand that the world, yes, as I said earlier, is an unsafe place for women, but rather than understanding we need to make revolution to change that, they're going to go into the furthest, most reactionary position to make a patriarchal bargain and basically, buy their protection through bargaining with these really reactionary men.
Which never ends well for women in general. I mean, this is something that's been done historically, Yeah,
and again, it totally mystifies the reality of violence against women, and it totally mystifies who is doing the beating and the raping, and it places this a complete fabrication. It is a total fabrication. They've made up this entire elaborate lie that trans women are the most dangerous people for cis women to be around, and
that displaces the threat of men.
Exactly, it does. But here's the ironic thing too: is they say that trans women are men and that's why they're a threat, but then will go in and make these patriarchal bargains with actual men to protect them. And it's like, can't you see how fucking ridiculous this is? But fascism is irrational.
Yes.
It doesn't have to make sense.
In fact, it revels in not making sense.
Yes. And even right now, as we're talking about all of these things, you can start to just poke holes in all of their logic. And, I have laid out all of these arguments so concisely to people that I've seen take these reactionary turns, and it just doesn't matter. They're so far past the point of needing something to actually be sound and to actually make sense. And that's what's scary about it, because it's kind of like a cult-like logic, and the attraction to it is this kind of cult-like attraction.
Absolutely.
It's really scary.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And there's a cultish element. You can find cultish elements among all forms of politics, especially extreme politics, but specifically on the far right. There's almost always this cultic element and this irrational element that is always present in these movements. And we certainly see it here. Something you were saying earlier, though, that I wanted to touch on before we move on is you're giving like these two simultaneous reasons for why the attack on women is simultaneous with the attack on the LGBTQ issue, and sort of understanding, what's really underneath all of this. Another thing that I see on the right in recent months, it's really, sort of get into a pinnacle, is this moral panic, is the only way I could really talk about it, regarding low birth rates, population decline, and even that recent Tucker Carlson thing about low testosterone levels in men. So this sort of panic is coming at the same time as we see this overturning of Roe, this clamping down on women's human and bodily autonomy and rights, and this this new sort of inflected, more hyperbolic, more hysterical hatred, attack, slander, and pointing all the guns at the LGBT community in particular. And so obviously, as you're talking about the reification of heteronormativity, especially in times of destabilization, all of these fears about low birth rate, population decline, and low testosterone revolve 100% around heteronormative cis male anxieties, and that's projected out onto the rest of society.
Yes, and there's also a really racist character to all of that shit. So, great replacement theory is a very popular patriarchal white right extremist theory, and Tucker Carlson actually started peddling this on fucking national television, which is absolutely insane. So basically, that theory says that you know the white race is going to be become the minority, and that the white race is going to be replaced by like all of these mixed children, and it's like fucking super racist, obviously. And that what we need to do is ban abortion and force white women to give birth to white babies so that we can repopulate the white race, especially in a country like America, which is obviously a white supremacist settler colony. This is really, really popular amongst the most extremist factions of fascists in right-wing conservatives in this country. So the mass shooter who shot up the grocery store in Buffalo, he put out this manifesto, and in it he references great replacement theory. So that's obviously that was a racial hate crime. He attacked a grocery store in a black neighborhood in one of the most segregated cities in the United States of America. I mean, it was a racial hate crime. And also, there is this deeply patriarchal ideology that is flowing through it that kind of masks itself in plain sight. So, like, when I went through and read that manifesto, because I did read it, the whole thing hinges on needing women to be reproductive slaves in the household. But he almost never even mentions the word women. I don't think he ever actually typed out the word women in it. But the whole thing, the oppression of women in this way is so central to the whole entire ideology. But it masks itself. It's male dominance is metaphysically perfect. It's so impossible to see sometimes. It hides in plain sight. But this great replacement theory and everything that you're talking about the impotence of men, and it also has to do with like men, this fear that men are becoming effeminate. It's this condemnation of like non-standard sexual habits, and seeing that if men can't impregnate women, then there's something deeply wrong with our society because it's emasculating men. All of this shit. It's so central to the entire ideology, and the fucked up shit too is that a lot of these the mass shooters who are all fascists, people like Tucker Carlson, who is a fascist, they're peddling a lot of these ideas that they find in incel communities and manosphere communities on the internet, like great replacement theory. All of that shit is super popular with incels.
Yeah.
I understand to a certain degree why people have this idea that we shouldn't give them any attention. They're just this niche group online. Like I get what people are saying when they say that, but they're wrong, because these ideas aren't niche anymore. They're being peddled by someone like Tucker Carlson. That's one of the most watched television shows in the United States of America, and basically online social media, these forums for incels and misogynists they're doing so much of the heavy ideological lifting for this rise of theocratic fascism. And I think we have made a grave mistake to not take them seriously and to not study what they have to say, because Tucker Carlson has been looking at it. These right-wing fascists have been, the people with power have been paying attention to what is happening with this online radicalization.
Oh yeah. Republican politicians. Oh yeah.
They're using those ideas and they're mainstreaming them, and they're becoming very popular. I mean, again, great replacement theory is just so explicitly white supremacist and so explicitly patriarchal that the idea that something that extreme was being peddled on a television show with that large of an audience is alarming. And, where those ideas are most popular are on these seemingly niche, internet forums that peddle in male supremacy, and it's really, really serious shit. So I picked up this book. Sorry, I'm kind of going on a tangent here. I picked up this book called Men Who Hate Women, by a woman named Laura Bates. I think she's a bit of a liberal in certain senses, but I think that her analysis is really good. And everyone should pick this up and read about her work in terms of studying these online communities of misogynists. It's really important to understand them right now, because the misogyny and the re-entrenching of these super heteronormative ideas about gender is so central to our moment and to what's happening. If we don't really understand that, then we don't understand fascism as like a broader political project. These extreme ideas, they come from the internet.
Yeah. Well,
and they take hold there.
I actually want to talk about that, about the manosphere in specific, but really quick, I just wanted to say something about this fear that men have, or, some men, the right-wing men have, about men becoming, more effeminate, in the low T testosterone anxiety is about that, the trans anxiety is about that, even stuff like, soy boys and soy face, it's very much about that. But the sad thing is, and one of the things you realize when you do any investigation of these communities, is that most of the men who are most vociferously launching these attacks and holding up this image of rugged masculinity and traditional masculinity are men that feel interiorly that they don't actually live up to their own image. And that produces the anxiety, the insecurity, and thus the overcompensation of a lot of these men. Like, they don't even live up to the image they have of masculine men in their own heads, and yet they're the ones most vociferously pushing, in lots of cases, towards this end. So I just think that's worth noting. But I want to talk about the manosphere in particular, and this is kind of hit home for me because I have some nephews who are entering their teenage years, and the manosphere has become very, very big right now. From Fresh and Fit, which is like a YouTube channel, to Kevin Samuels, who recently died, but his whole thing was, specifically telling black women that they weren't attractive and they were overweight and they'll never get the guy that they want, a high-value man, right? They started making these shirts, by the way, that men, I guess, unironically buy, that says high-value man on the front of it. I mean, if you have to advertise yourself as such, me think doth protest too much. But there's another figure who's very, very influential as of very recently, named Andrew Tate, and he's making the runs, and he's lifted up by figures in the comedy world or whatever, and has now become a viral sort of mega influencer star online, and his entire thing is just rampant misogyny, a deep hatred for women, and a reification of these masculinist ideas and conceptions. And I have a nephew who came to me, and we were watching some YouTube together, just like whatever. And he got mentioned, Andrew Tate got mentioned, and my nephew was like, oh, the top G. That's what he calls himself, the top G. And, sort of laughed about it. Like, oh, I've seen this guy on TikTok, and just sort of came off as like a funny figure, right? Like a viral figure that has come across my social media and that I think is amusing. And so then I had to haha, yeah, he is a bit of a clown. But I had to sit down and be like, but everything that he says about women is the exact opposite. You can laugh at these people. You can enjoy their virality to some extent. But I just had this talk with my nephew, please don't take these ideas seriously. These are the antithesis of how you should ever talk to, treat, or think about women. And so I'm able to make a little intervention in my, 12-year-old nephew's life. But there are millions and millions of men around this country in particular who have nobody even attempting to make that intervention, or nobody that even knows that an intervention is needed, and are just being ushered down this, this hallway of pure, real, venomous misogyny, to say nothing of the anti-LGBTQ sentiments that arise in these formations as well. So what are your thoughts on the manosphere in particular?
So I think that, fascist extremists will say this pretty openly, that misogyny is the ultimate gateway drug to get people into a larger set of fascist politics. but it begins with misogyny. And so, with that being said, you know, as the point that you just made, these we can call them men's rights activists, basically. They are really popular on the internet, and they're excellent propagandists. They are genius propagandists. They use irony. There's so many levels of irony to what they're doing. It's that kind of irrationalism that fascists love to use. And they're everywhere. They're everywhere, and they prey on all of these, these fears that young boys have, and all of these insecurities that young boys have, and they do start young. They do target young boys. Your nephew's 12, and he knew about this guy. I mean, that's so scary. And they basically, what the Manosphere says to men is that, and boys, is that, the reason why you have all of these problems is because of feminism and because of women. That is the core tenet of the ideology. They think that they've reversed it. They've said that they peddle this lie that women have the most power, and that women basically control the what would they call it? I guess the sexual arena. That women are totally in control, that women have all of this power, and that feminism is the dominant ideology in society, and that they have been sold a lie that men are, actually, they've been sold this lie that men are powerful, when in fact men are the oppressed ones, and women are the ones who have all this sexual power over them. And it's super fucking dangerous because, again, it mystifies the contradiction of class, of who's really, who's really in power and who's really in charge, and what a lot of these feelings that young boys are having, they're able to, in this really twisted kind of like rhetorical move, basically conspiratorially paint women as this like master race, basically. And they view their biological essentialists. They view men and women as essentially different animals, really. And that women are, by nature of their like brain, of our brain chemistry and the way that our brains function, we are like an inferior species that is absolutely a different species than men even. And this all sounds totally insane. I'm aware of that because it's total fucking bullshit, as we know. But, again, they're excellent propagandists. And the way that they put this information into the world, onto TikTok, onto all of these incel forums, on Twitter, on Instagram, they're really good at peddling all of these extremist ideas as something that is common sense. And if you are a young boy who is just getting online and just using the internet, it's all just right there for you. And they create basically a community that can answer all of these questions that you have, about sex and life. And they kind of create like a fraternity. And if you're a super isolated, alienated young boy on the internet, it's very appealing. It's very appealing. And within weeks of getting onto these forums, they start posting, and already the ideology is so potent that like within weeks of being on these forums, already you're going to start seeing young boys, 14, 15, making rape threats, asking other people on the forums, how do I rape a woman or a girl and get away with it? Jesus right? Christ. Like it happens almost immediately. It's just as quick as like the anti-trans stuff happens in feminism. The turnaround is like from curious to extremist is like it can happen in a week, and it's such like a drink the Kool-Aid type of thing. And I think it was the editor of, what is that magazine, like Stormtrooper, that super racist Nazi rag.
Oh yeah. Stormfront, I think.
Stormfront. He explicitly said, we recruit from these incel communities. This is where we find like the base for our politics. It's through this misogyny, and it is so pervasive, and it's like there's something called a rape cell. So we know incels, but then within the category of incels, there's like all of these different subsects, and one of them is called a rape cell, and it's basically men who know that they can't get laid, so what they've resorted to is just raping with impunity. And who knows if these people are actually doing that or if it's purely just an online,
sure,
performance, but it doesn't really make a difference.
Its impact on the community is the same. Yeah,
exactly right. And another point I want to make here too is these are not just 5 or 6 or 7 or a dozen, boys, on the internet. These are groups that have thousands and thousands of members, thousands and thousands of people posting on these forums, and there's thousands and thousands of threads that are talking about this shit. It's not super small.
Yes.
Obviously, they represent a minority of men, but the idea that these are just like lone extremists is wrong. This is a pretty big online movement. It's not as niche as people want to think.
Absolutely. It's huge. It's huge. And yeah, there's like concentric circles. So like you have the toxic like forums where they're openly discussing rape, but then you go out a few degrees and then you have the manosphere, go out a few more degrees. You might have the Tucker Carlsons and the Joe Rogans of the world, right? And so it's all sort of connected, whether the people involved fully understand those connections or not. One of the implicit messages from the manosphere is women are the reason, and feminism in particular, their movement, is the reason why you are single, are unhappy, are insecure, have no prospects in your life. It's not the economic system. It's not the hyper-atomized culture that comes with the hyper-capitalist system that, defangs and destroys community and communality and all of these things. No, it's women and their movement for feminism. And men, especially young boys, insecure young boys, they can easily take that in as just a fact, and it certainly is treated as such. And then you look at figures like, I always thought this was very interesting. I don't know if you know who Andrew Tate and Kevin Samuels are. Do you have any familiarity?
No, I don't know them.
Okay. They're two really huge figures in the manosphere in particular. And you're talking about how they appeal specifically to younger boys, which I think is spot on. It's mostly younger boys watching this shit. One of the ways that Andrew Tate does it is, he puts together this entire life of, I think he made a lot of money on Bitcoin or some weird shit, right? And so he makes this whole thing about him smoking expensive cigars and driving awesome cars and living in a mansion and having lots of women all around him all the time, and he'll say things like, if you make 1 penny less than me, you're nothing to me, like hyper-capitalist ideology alongside the women, anti-feminist, misogynist shit, but also the aesthetics of being cool. So young boys are definitely going to like the fast cars and the lots of women in bikinis and the cool guy smoking a cigar, in tattoos. And that makes the whole allure of him even more. What Kevin Samuels did, I think, is a little different. And he's speaking largely to a black community. And I could not, he passed away now, but I could not help but notice that Kevin Samuels dressed almost exactly like Malcolm X in those classic pictures of X in like the suit with the big glasses, And what does that convey in the black community? It conveys a sense of wisdom, a sense of I am an elder in the black community, just the aesthetics of dressing like Malcolm X. I don't know if that was a conscious choice or not, but when you're speaking to a black community almost exclusively, that aesthetic decision, I think, has consequences for your credibility to that community. And so I thought that was either incredibly cynical and sneaky on his part or just completely coincidental. But the last thing I wanted to say, aside of all of that, is you're talking about these incel and these rape cell communities and how grotesque it is. And then you have the manosphere and all these elements of online communities coming together to form this, this brutal misogyny But pornography is also another aspect here. Those same boys who are on those rape cell and incel forums hating women are also the boys that are almost certainly only being exposed to sex and romantic sex of any sort through the distorted, grotesque lens of online, easily accessible pornography. So you add that into the mix, that's throwing, huge amounts of gasoline on an already exploding fire.
Absolutely right. And what does this pornography teach these boys? And sometimes boys start watching pornography as early as like 9 and 10. And this is, pornography is so violent. Especially now, it's gotten to such an extreme degree. It's absolutely insane, the things that you can find on these websites. But what is this teaching men that and boys is that women are available to you, and women exist for sex and for you to fuck. That's what's being taught, and that's so you have this like pornography is an ideological weapon against radical consciousness. Absolutely, it is. It's propaganda, and especially when you have something like the internet and the way that it's pornography on demand, and it's just you and your personal tastes, however violent or ridiculous and racist they might be, and it's basically like a direct teacher of this violent misogyny. And so, but it's not seen that way. It's seen as something that is pleasurable, right? Like, the idea that watching women suffer through sex, and then you beat off to it, and you derive pleasure from these images of violence. That does a number on your brain. And there have been so many studies about what pornography does to the brains of young boys. People of all genders, watch it, but obviously, majority of people who are watching pornography are boys and men. But, it does a number on your brain on a chemical level. This also kind of ties into with like these ideas of like men being impotent, men not being able to get it up, like all of these super masculinist ideas, or men not being able to like deliver in bed, all of these fears that you see being peddled by these super right-wing patriarchal men. A lot of that can also be tied back to their addiction to pornography and what they expect out of sex, and that women can never deliver that, and nor should we want to, because a lot of those images are violent, and then you have in young boys, as men as young as like 27, 28, with like intense erectile dysfunction and things like this, that's directly linked to this kind of widespread addiction to internet pornography. I mean, it's all connected, and that shit radicalizes you. And then you go in, you log onto the internet after you were just, masturbating to some violent shit, and then get on these forums, or even not forums, even something as widespread in usage as like Twitter. And then you see this kind of misogynistic ideology being peddled there. Mm-hmm. It's a complete like onslaught, like a vicious onslaught of anti-feminist misogyny constantly all the time. And because I keep saying this, but it's because it's true, male dominance is so, metaphysically perfect. It hides in plain sight. We can't even necessarily clock it as male dominance. We take it for granted to such a degree. We don't have the left needs to develop the tools to fight that. Because in so doing, we're also fighting fascism, because, it's my wager that you do not have fascism without the subjugation of women. So I think that in order to even be good anti-fascists, we have to really understand this stuff. And it's not pretty, and it's scary. And it also challenges some very, firmly held beliefs that we have, particularly in a country like the United States that is so obsessed with like freedom of speech, right? But we have to ask, freedom of speech for whom? And a lot of this misogyny And a lot of this violent pornography kind of sneaks into our discourse and permeates our lives through this defense of like freedom and liberty. And basically what they're saying is freedom and liberty for men to abuse women. That's what they're really saying. But it's all couched in this logic of like, well, you can't critique, you know, what people say, you know, freedom of speech. You can't critique what people are ingesting. You know, that's their personal business. If they're watching pornography, that's not the realm of politics. You know, we have to protect that, our liberties, all this fucking bullshit. You know what I'm saying? But really, that's the mechanism in which these ideologies are protected. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, well said, 100% correct. And just thinking of pornography as its own rabbit hole of extremism, I think is helpful here, because it really does. I mean, it just like any other rabbit hole, extremism we talk about online, pornography itself is this algorithmically charged rabbit hole descent into more and more forms of obscure, violent, niche forms of sexual encounters. And somebody who spends time on that will get sucked in that direction no matter what. And so we have to think of that as pornography in and of itself as one version of that, and we need to combat it truly. And I think a hinge point and something that comes up, because you're just talking about the left needs to react to this stuff. We need to respond vociferously and robustly to this very popular, hyper-viral, masculinist emerging tradition thing, whatever, formation. And so, you know, what do? Well, they play, as we said many times, on oftentimes inherent male insecurity. I mean, porn or everything else aside, being a teenager is a insecure time, no matter, you know, what gender you are. And, you know, certainly men and young boys have their own forms of insecurity through their teenage years. And people like these manosphere influencers, these Andrew Tates, these misogynists who are popular online, they play into that insecurity by diminishing women. You know, your insecurity is valid because these women are the real problem. And so if we're going to take seriously this idea that the left should respond to this shit and create communities in parallel to these toxic ones that can address the same shit, one thing that we'd have to do is address that underlying insecurity and come up with healthier ways of dealing with it, but also have to be as online, perhaps as present online as these other forces are. Because as you said, no matter where you turn online, a lot of this stuff will be reified, reinforced, bolstering one another. And so, you know, the left is going to have to do that as well, have a presence online, dealing with the root cause of this shit, but in a healthier way. And yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely, I agree. And I think that a lot of like what, you know, a lot of these insecurities that come up, particularly when it comes to sex, has to do with the way that sex functions in patriarchal society. You know, so like when young boys feel insecure about certain sexual relations that they might have or desire, a lot of that comes from being taught that men are entitled to sex. That is such like a taken for granted thing in our society. And even in defenses of the sex trade that you see from these like pro-sex work, blah, 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 leftists, whatever, the underlying idea even in that is that, you know, men should be able to have sex whenever they want, sex on demand, mm-hmm. which is the essence of rape culture, right? Yes. That is the foundation of that. And so, you know, when we are teaching young boys and when we are, you know, dealing with, and of course also teaching young women, is we have to really attack that idea because it is so fundamental to all of this. And it's an idea that's being taught in pornography. So it's like young boys have a kind of a break in their brain when it comes to what they've been taught since they're children and what they learn in pornography and just the overall objectification of women throughout society in every aspect of our culture, is this sexual entitlement. And so when they step out into the real world and that is not what it actually is, and that women do have some sort of agency, and that we do have our own sexual needs, right? These what they've been taught and what they've been told and what the reality is are so different from one another. It causes like a a very, very vicious kind of alienation, and it like a source of intense violence, because you feel like you have been wronged, because what you've been told is that you get free reign over women as sexual objects, and it turns out, hey, women are actually people.
Yeah.
You know, and it causes an intense fracturing of your own psyche. You know, it's really destabilizing, and you know, and that's why the most extreme of these young boys, it's like the incel types, they go and they shoot up rooms full of children, and I think it comes from this what we teach young boys about women, and when you really pick that apart, and again, it's something we take for granted, you know, it seems because it's so commonplace. When you really pull that apart, you know, the ideology of this sexual entitlement is like, it's so widespread, and it's so inherently violent, and it shapes most men's worldview, even if you're not a guy that's going out and raping women all the time. You know, you don't have to be some serial rapist in order to be operating in your life in such a way that reinforces that idea. But it's everywhere, and it's the groundwork for so many of these extremist ideologies. You know, absolutely. Women exist for sex and for reproducing. That's it. Yeah. And so I think, you know, we need to, as feminists, as Marxists, that's like an idea that we really have to take more seriously as like a political project. It's not just like, you know, it's not about just like changing like one person's mind at a time. You know, we have to bring in this kind of feminist analysis into our organizations. You know, we have to make it the foundation of our politics, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and if there are these factions of the left being won over by reaction on these issues, that's an indictment of us as the left, as the real left, to combat these forces, to emphasize this stuff in our organizing, in our political education, and to really center it in our analysis going forward. Because when we don't do that enough, or vociferously enough, or robustly enough, we see how these narratives are easily winning people over across the political spectrum. And so it's just more of us. It's our job to continue to combat this in whatever ways we can. And you tying in mass shootings to this entire discussion, I think, is really interesting. I hadn't really contemplated that, but certainly most of these mass shooters would fit into the category of incel, these angsty, violent, angry, often young men, teenage, early 20-somethings, spending way too much fucking time on the internet, regardless of the ostensible reason they give. Some have a manifesto, some seem completely out of left field. They all seem to share several of these characteristics, and that's deeply tied to the broader conversation we're having about, you know, the rise of fascism, the manosphere, anti-feminist and anti-women sentiment, anti-LGBTQ sentiment, conspiratorialism. It's all right there. So yeah, that was insightful.
No, it's something that I've been really, because, you know, mass shootings have always been a problem here, but I feel as though, as of recently especially, they've become more explicit in like the political role that they play, because I think it's easy to throw a kind of fundamentally liberal analysis at it and see it as like individuals acting, you know, like these crazy lone wolf individuals who are sick in the head, and you know, it's painted as they're an anomaly. In the sense they are an anomaly, right? But after everything that we've just been talking about, they're actually, in a lot of senses, acting in a way that is completely consistent with what they have been told and what they have been taught. And, you know, America, the United States of America, we produce death. That's what this country does. It is a death machine. And so it makes total sense that, you know, we have, what I would argue, these political agents who have been taught all of these things that we have just been talking about, on top of the fact that we live in the belly of the imperial core of a country that produces death on a mass scale, they go and they shoot up a school. It's not that they're sick in the head per se. Of course they are, but they're fucking evil people. But also, I think a stronger analysis of it is like they're also completely consistent with what it is that we do here, and they're 100% acting on behalf of a political regime of that is the norm in this country. And I think that when you understand it in this way, you can see how they really are political agents. They're not. I'm not saying that they're like funded by the feds, because that's conspiratorial thinking.
Of course.
But they're
plugged into broader structures. They're conditioned.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And
even
so
ostensibly non-political or apolitical mass shootings where there's no clear motive, no manifesto, no political orientation, it's still an inherently political act.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's just another book that's really great. It's called Male Fantasies, and it was written in the 70s. And so he uses psychoanalysis, and some of that is like not necessarily up my alley, but what I think is fascinating, the point that he makes in this book is that, and he does it through, he basically he went and found all of these different letters and memoirs that were written by the German proto-fascists before the Nazis came into power. And his dad was sympathetic to Nazism and also to these proto-fascists. So a lot of this book, he's trying to figure out, like, why are these men, why do we become fascists? What is that? So he finds all of these letters and all of these, primary materials. And basically the thread that connects them all is that they all are violent misogynists, and that and this is kind of striking in its similarity to incels, is that these aren't like players who are like sexualizing women. It's a whole nother layer. These men want to kill women. It's a very not that they wouldn't rape women, but the rape is like secondary to the core belief that women pose a threat and women need to die. That this is such a part of this the fascist male fantasy is the mass murder of women. And so and they had these militias, the German Freikorps, and they were the proto-fascists who basically
they killed Rosa.
Yeah, exactly right. And he makes a lot of amazing points about how he talks about this concept of the red women, and that communist women, Jewish women are seen as like this massive threat to this patriarchal male power that is foundational to fascism. And so they have so many of these fantasies about the murder of red women. And it's so similar to, if you go on these incel forums and read what these people say, it's almost indistinguishable from the kind of shit that you read in this book, Male Fantasies, where he's talking about the proto-fascists who were the harbingers of Nazism in Germany. I mean, the similarities are so striking. And when you read it in that way and you understand the history of this specific type of misogyny, it is a very harrowing view of what is to come. It's not looking good. And then when you see that paired with these larger, the judicial coup in SCOTUS, in the larger political system, it's like, holy shit, the fascism it's real, and it is fascism, and I think we should call it that. I think people sometimes, because that word has been overused and kind of lost its meaning for a while, people are scared to call things fascist. But now it's like, no. This is actually fascism that's happening, and we should be able to name it as such.
100%, absolutely. Well, my friend, I think we're at our time limit here. I want to be respectful of the time you have at the place you're recording. But I found this conversation to be absolutely not only, enlightening, but desperately needed at this time to help make sense of all these seemingly disparate trends and forces and how they're more or less structured by the same underlying values and ideological formations. And so always a pleasure to have you on. Open invite anytime you want to come back for any reason. I just love talking with you and learning from you. But before I let you go, is there anything else you want to say? Any last words, any recommendations, or anything you want to plug?
So books to read. I have two that I think everyone would really learn a lot from. Men Who Hate Women by Laura Bates and Male Fantasies by Klaus Thielveit. I cannot pronounce his last name. I just butchered that.
That's all right.
But if you look up Male Fantasies and Klaus, his last name starts with a T. It's a very German name. Two books that have been essential for me in understanding this. Oh, and also a book called Right Wing Women by Andrea Dworkin that talks about, the appeal of the right to women and why women basically are signing up for their own brutal subjugation. Amazing book. And also, I have been doing my own podcast with a group of women that specifically is about feminism. It's called Private Life, and it's on Spotify. It's on everything, and we're doing some cool work over there. If you want just more straight feminism, a place for that's what we're doing. So
Sweet.
If you want to listen to it, please do.
Wonderful. Yeah, I will link to those in the show notes. I'll definitely link to Private Life. I'll follow and subscribe right now, actually. And yeah, I'm really interested going forward in coming up with ways that the left can push back on this internet front regarding how the insecurities, particularly of young boys, are preyed upon by these manosphere types. And I certainly think whatever response the left comes up with, it will be rooted in feminism, absolutely.